sitting vice chair with the absence of a chair at this point in time, I'll start the meeting. Before we start our official business, I would like to take a minute and acknowledge our fellow board member, served on this board for 9 years, and my personal friend, Mike Snipper. When Jan and I moved to Oxford 40 years ago, Mike was one of the first two people we met. We hadn't sold our house in Salina yet, and we moved into the Contreras Park townhouses. Mike was working for the owners in maintenance, and he was servicing our furnace since winter was there, and the other tenants had moved out. And just the first day Mike and I met, we became friends, and we were friends for 40 years. As a member of this board, he served with distinction for 9 years. He was the vice chair for 4 of those years and the chair for 3 of those years. He ran a tight meeting. He was very courteous and very professional with the staff of the city always, with the people who came before the board always. I want to offer my personal condolences to his widow, and just as a member of the board, thank him for his service to the city of Oxford. With that,
can we get an official communication from the board to his family? Is that something?
I think that would be fine.
Yeah. Appreciation.
I was so moved.
thank you. With that, we'd like to welcome our 2 new members of the board and ask Mr. Conner to have the swearing-in ceremony.
Gentlemen, if we come down here, please.
If you would, raise your right hand, and I state your name.
I, Phil Russo,
I, Donald Chadwick Smith,
Solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution
solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution
of the United States and the state of Ohio,
of the United States and the state of Ohio,
and will obey the laws thereof,
and will obey the laws thereof,
and will obey the laws thereof,
and that I will in all respects
and that I will in all respects
uphold and enforce the provisions of the Charter
uphold and enforce the provisions of the Charter
and ordinances of the city of Oxford,
and ordinances of the city of Oxford,
and will faithfully discharge the duties
and will faithfully discharge the duties
of the Board of Zoning Appeals of the city of Oxford,
of the Board of Zoning Appeals of the city of Oxford,
of which I am a member.
of which I am a member.
Congratulations.
thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Chad, congratulations. Welcome to the board of Oxford Zoning Appeals.
Thank you. Thanks.
Our next item of business is the election of officers for the coming term. We need to elect a chair, vice chair, and secretary.
I'll move Roger Ames as chair.
Second.
Roger Ames has been nominated and seconded. Are there any further nominations? Hearing none. Could we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Ames,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Conrad,
Yes.
Ms. Rumanier,
Yes.
Mr. Russo.
Yes.
For vice chair, I'll accept nominations. I really will accept nominations.
I wonder if Ms. Rosanier, having served on the board previously.
Is that a form of a nomination?
Yes, yes it is.
I second it.
Are there any further nominations for vice chair? Hearing none, may we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Conrad,
Yes.
Ms. Rumanier,
Yes.
Mr. Russo,
Yes.
and Mr. Ames.
Yes. And for secretary?
I nominate Phil Russo for secretary.
Thank you.
No, I'll decline.
I would second that.
Second, the declining.
The decline.
Thanks, Cal. And I nominate Cal Conrad.
Second.
We have a nomination and a seconding. Are there any further nominations? Hearing none, may we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Conrad,
Yes.
Ms. Rumanier,
Yes.
Mr. Russo,
Yes.
and Mr. Ames.
Yes. Okay, we have a slate of officers for the coming term. The next item on the agenda is the approval of the June 28th. We're gonna bypass the approval and go for adoption of the June 28th. Because there were only 2 members of the present board at that meeting. So if we could have a motion to adopt.
I would so adopt.
If we could, first though, see if Mr. Conrad and Lumiere had any changes to
Do
their
you have any changes to the minutes of that meeting?
No.
Yeah.
None.
Having no changes, can we have a motion to adopt the minutes?
So moved.
Yeah,
Second.
been motioned and seconded. All in approval, signify by saying aye for the adoption. Aye. Okay, our one case of business tonight is BZA 2022-03, 327 West Spring Street. Variances for a trash enclosure location, parking in front setback, maximum parking in front of the main structure, and loading space. We'll accept the motion to move to adjudication.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and second to move to adjudication. Appearing for the city is Sir.
Yes,
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in the matters before this board?
I do.
Please state your name and occupation and presence for the record, please.
Yes, Zachary Moore, city planner for the city of Oxford, Ohio.
If you would go ahead then.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, members of the board. So this is our first and only case of the night. This is a series of variance requests at 327 West Spring Street. This was formerly a gas station. It was a Circle K convenience store combined with a Marathon gas station. That use has since vacated the site as of December of last year. So the request that's coming before the board now, the new use that's being requested is a new restaurant. So the site would be put to use as a new restaurant. And I will go over the case details. Again, this is BZA 2022-03. So not many cases so far this year. This is only the third. Here's my slide clicker's not working at this moment. Okay, there we go. So some basic details on the request. The applicant is Scott Webb Architect, who is with us tonight. The property owner is Miami Mobile Home Park LLC under the care of Gail J. Willis. The current zoning classification of the property is GB General Business District. The current use is commercial, but of course it's vacant now. It's not presently in use by any particular tenant. And the proposal, so the applicant is looking to request a new restaurant use, which is a permitted use in the general business district. But in order to do that, in order to change the use from a former gas station to a restaurant, certain code aspects have to come into compliance. There was a preliminary zoning review that was delivered in August that outlined a number of different things. So from that letter, which is toward the back end of your packet, these 4 things were requested by the applicant to vary from code, those being the trash enclosure location, parking in the front yard setback, maximum parking in front of the structure, and a loading space requirement. I'll go through each of those here in greater detail. Just to get you acquainted with the site, so this is an aerial map showing the location of the subject property. This is at the southeast corner of Spring Street and Locust Street. So within the vicinity, wow, this is completely dead, isn't it? I will use the mouse. So here's the subject property here. Looks like it's AAA. Do you have some?
Give me a second.
Okay. I'll continue on with the laptop for now. So this is the this is actually an aerial image from 2020. This shows you the building, which still exists. There was a canopy that came overhead. There were 2 pump islands here. Those were demolished last year. So only the building and the excess parking area still remains to this day. Within the vicinity, there's the Speedway gas station, which is across South Locust Street to the west. There's the South Locust Apartments to the south. There's another separate retail building to the east. Used to be the home of a business called Peak Health and Nutrition. That's at 325 West Spring. To the north is an electric substation, and then to the northwest is the Walgreens store. So just getting you acquainted with that. Thank you very much. And then this is a look at the same extent, but showing the zoning classification in the area. It's all Zone GB general business, as shown in red here. So it's pretty firmly within a commercial portion of the city. And here is a look at the bird's eye view of the property. So again, this is an older image that showed what the gas station used to look like with the canopy and the pumps in place. The pylon sign, the branding has been removed from that sign. The sign still exists. However, that will need to come down should a new use occupy the site because it has not been used for a period of 6 months unless another variance were sought at another time. These are some site photos that were taken on August 19th. So this shows you the existing building that's there. It is oriented toward, thank you very much. Doesn't work? Oh, okay, that's too bad. I'll make do. Appreciate the effort. This shows you kind of the remnants of what used to be a trash area for a dumpster to service the use. There are 2 curb cuts into the site. One is off South Locust, which is shown down here in the lower left. In the lower right, this is a second curb cut off of West Spring. There's also a fairly sizable tree that is beside the building, and this is off of the South Locust Street side. Okay, and so this is a closer look at the aerial imagery from 2020. And the next slide maintains the same position, but this is a look at the submitted site plan that we've received from the applicant. So obviously it acknowledges that the canopy has now gone away. The edge of the existing parking area is right along here, and that is proposed to be converted to lawn space. So it's kind of tightening up the parking area, adding some new curbing, ensuring that the minimum number of spaces for a new restaurant use are being provided. The minimum is 16. They are showing a total of 19 spaces, so that standard in and of itself is being met. A couple other features that are proposed. So there is a new outdoor dining patio that's proposed. This is to the northeast side of the building, just shown right here. The applicant's also showing a number of trees to be planted, and that's to comply with the code's tree planting requirements that are specific to parking. So parking can be, in essence, a trigger to require a certain number of trees be planted. So that is why those are shown on this site plan. And just for contextual purposes, the existing pylon sign is located right up here. Okay, so in the staff report, the 4 different variances are numbered. Figured it's probably best just to number them so we know which variance we're talking about at any given moment. So starting with variance number 1, and if you wish to follow along, this is page 5 of the packet would probably be most appropriate. This is out of section 1141.04J3, which provides the following. It says, following regulations shall be applied to all existing commercial or multiple dwelling structures whenever there's a redevelopment or a change of use, which clearly that's what is proposed to occur. Down at subsection G, that states that the storage enclosure area shall not be in the front yard or the right-of-way. So in order to accommodate the space for the planned outdoor patio, that is presently the location of their trash area. So what they would like to do is move it to another part of the site, but that other part of the site they're moving it to happens to be within the front yard. So that is the reason why they need variance number 1. So the variance, strictly speaking, is to subsection G. So returning to the site plan, the front yard is shown in orange here, so it's to the north and to the west of the existing building, which is right here. And the proposed enclosure and pad is shown here in blue. So as you can see, that is located within the orange area. So that's the reason for the variance request. The existing trash area is right around in this area right here. So the only portion of the site where a variance would not be needed would be this area that's highlighted in kind of a red dashed line. This is the area where it'd be allowed without a variance. It's probably not very, excuse me, didn't mean to do that. It's probably not very feasible to somehow create an entryway through this direction. If anything, it might be potentially viable to have a trash area over here, but it would involve expanding the pavement further to the south. But nevertheless, this is where it is proposed off of the, pretty close to the curb cut off of South Locust Street. So that's variance number 1. Variance number 2, this is out of section 1149.07B. So we're in the parking chapter at this point. That's 1149. Section B is driving the location of parking spaces. So this is whenever there's any new parking spaces that are being situated on a site, any new spaces have to comply with the current code requirements. So the second variance is being sought to subsection 1, which specifies that parking spaces shall not be located within the required front setback. So going back to the site plan, so I've kind of highlighted the 19 total parking spaces for you here off of the proposed aisleway. And this is a look at the front yard setback line, and that's a 35-foot minimum front yard setback in the general business district. So you can see the spaces that fall within that setback are highlighted in red here. So in order for those 13 of the 19 spaces to fall within the front yard setback, a variance would need to be granted. And that's variance number 2. Variance number 3 is also out of the parking chapter, so this is 1149.07. It's the same section as variance 2, just going down to another subsection. This happens to be subsection 3. So in the general business district, the maximum total number of off-street parking spaces provided on the site in front of the principal structure cannot exceed 70% of the total number of required off-street spaces. This is the normal zoning code provision. Okay, so returning to the site plan, so highlighted here is the front yard, and that is influenced by the position of the building, which is right here. So as you can see, all 19 spaces are within the front yard. The way that this provision is supposed to work, so if they were meeting the minimum requirement of 16 spaces, when you take 70% of that, that's 11. So technically speaking, 11 spaces could be located in front, but because they have all 16 of the required spaces plus 3 additional spaces, that is why they need a variance to be granted. So it's 100% of the spaces that are falling within that front yard area in front of the structure.
Could you demonstrate the chart plan that has the red, the non-parking?
The non-parking? I'm
Yes.
sorry, I'm not
Well,
understanding.
You placed 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, 7 were eliminated.
Is that the,
Are you referring to variance 2 where I had the red
yeah,
here?
yeah.
Yeah, so for variance 2, it's going off of the setback line, which is a different concept from being in front of the structure. So, and the front yard setback line is measured 35 feet off of the front lot line, which in this case, since it's a corner lot, there's a front lot line along West Spring and another one off of South Locust. So this is the area that constitutes the setback, and that particular code standard that's cited in number 2 specifies that you cannot have any parking spaces in this area. So these spaces here are compliant.
Thank you.
Okay, great. No problem. So with regard to variance number 3, the code language for that one says that the parking spaces, it's talking about those that are in front of the principal structure. So that can include the setback area plus additional area in between the setback and the structure. So that's the reason why the degree of variation with this particular request, it actually is 100% of all the spaces being in front of the structure. The last variance is 1149.07E2, and this provides a loading space requirement, and this is required for all non-residential uses, and it specifies that one loading space is required for a floor area that is, let's see, it says one additional loading space shall be required for each 20,000 square feet or fraction thereof floor area over the first 10,000 square feet. So the building is 2,400 square feet, so you only need one space, and the sizing of that space is 10 feet wide by 25 feet long. So somewhere on the site, a loading space has to be provided, and the reason for that is to have a space allocated for deliveries for the use.
Can you define a loading space? What does that mean?
Pretty much what I just said. So it's a space where a delivery vehicle or a service vehicle of some kind can park that is not interfering with overall traffic circulation or taking up space that's normally occupied by customer parking or normal parking spaces. So oftentimes we'll see these situated off to the side of the site or behind a building at kind of like a service entrance that tends to be concealed away from the front or main face of the structure. I'm not saying that's technically a code definition. I'm not sure if we have a code definition, strictly speaking, that's written into code, but I believe that's the intent of this particular provision when it talks about loading spaces. So the requirement is to have one loading space, and the request is essentially to eliminate this requirement. So the loading space is missing from the site plan, and that's shown here dimensionally, so the 10 feet wide by 25 feet long, right here, so shown in blue. And when you think about potential places where a delivery vehicle of some kind might park to service a restaurant use, obviously restaurants are going to have deliveries that take place. There's really not an adequate space that would not interfere with the customer parking spots, as you see here. So, you know, with parking near the street, that could potentially impede access into the site in this location here. If we were to park in kind of this aisleway area between the the island here and the edge that might impede the traffic flow coming to and from this direction. Parking in the middle aisle here could impede the ability of vehicles parked in these parking spaces to exit or enter those spaces. The applicant believes that this space is not necessary, that essentially deliveries can be taken care of just based on this design as presented. But just to walk through a couple scenarios of where a potential space could be situated, because one of the criteria for determining whether to grant a variance is this the only solution to the predicament, or is there some other solution? Not saying these are the only solutions, but just to demonstrate visually that I think the spirit of the code can be met, the literal code can be met through some kind of solution that is design oriented. So just a couple examples. So to kind of tuck an area maybe into this location here, still preserving the walkway to and from the building, which is located here. It would be at more of a right angle, which isn't quite as pedestrian friendly, but it would allow for some space where a vehicle could park that wouldn't impede the traffic flow quite as much. But you can see it is kind of interfering into this aisleway here with this particular proposal. I think a lot of this has to do with the situation of where the patio is. So if that patio were moved a little further to the south, that might offer a little bit more flexibility in terms of vehicles circulating in and out. Another solution would be to keep the patio where it is, but extend the pavement even further, so you can see that kind of frees up a little bit more room and better preserves the 24-foot wide aisleway going between these two locations here, and then relocating the walkway, and it could fall actually in the middle of the parking area and have a kind of like a crosswalk, which would be required to have concrete to differentiate from the asphalt. So this is kind of showing a potential possibility. To do something like this would likely come at the cost of 1 to 2 parking spaces. Again, I'm not saying that this is the only design solution out there, but I'm just throwing something up on the slide conceptually to show you that there may be other possibilities of achieving compliance where a variance would not be necessary.
Question.
Yes, sir.
If they cut down, if you would bring up the previous slide, if they cut down the large tree, would there be space behind the building?
To do a loading space
Yes.
back here? I'm not sure if that space is viable, and it would also need to meet the proper setback of 6 feet for a parking space, and I'm not sure if there's enough width in there to accomplish that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so those are the 4 variances, and I will now go through the decision criteria. And unlike most cases where we've got 1 or 2 variances to keep track of, there's a lot of variances in the picture here with a total of 4. So I will try to explain this as best I can and how each criterion applies to each variance. So criterion A is whether the property in question will yield reasonable return or whether there can be any beneficial use of the property without the variance. So when talking about variance number 1, this was the trash enclosure location being in the front yard. You could have a new trash enclosure that was built in close proximity to the present location that's there on the northeast side of the building. But per the applicant's commentary, it seems that this would render the ability to provide an outdoor patio less viable. However, a reasonable return would likely still be possible even if this patio feature were removed from the overall scope. So we find that criterion A does not support variance number 1. However, with respect to variance numbers 2 and 3, so this is an existing commercial site. It's proposed to be adaptively reused as a restaurant. And we're finding that it cannot be adaptively reused unless variances are granted to numbers 2 and 3. If you were to deny these parking-related variances, so again, this is for the parking within the front yard setback, as well as parking being in front of the structure. If you were to deny these variances, this is basically going to necessitate a complete redevelopment of this site. It would entail demolition of the building, more complex reconfiguration of the parking area. I'm going to turn to the slide as I talk about this. And the probable financial investment that would be required to comply with these straight code requirements would be far more significant and quite possibly impede business activity at the site, which has not been performing since the vacation of the gas station use. So we find that Criterion A supports variances 2 and 3. With respect to variance number 4, so if variance number 1 were granted and the patio allowed to be built as proposed, it seems possible that the parking area pavement could be expanded to accommodate a loading area beside the patio, like what's shown here on this slide. The patio could also shift location further south to make for a larger loading area that would not interfere as much with the parking aisle circulation. So again, this patio could shift further south to accommodate more room. So we find that Criterion A does not support variance number 4, but only if variance number 1 were granted. Otherwise, we feel that it supports. Criterion B is whether the variance is substantial. So given that this is a pretty small corner lot, a lot of exposed frontage onto West Spring Street and South Locust Street, there's really little to no creative ways to hide some of the unpleasant features of the site, like the trash enclosure, the parking, again, without doing something that is a more significant redevelopment, or even possible collaboration with other nearby properties or owners to take into account a larger amount of land. With this perspective in mind, staff does not believe variances 1, 2, or 3 are substantial. However, with respect to variance 4, the loading requirement, so eliminating potential space for a loading zone for restaurant-related deliveries seems to be more substantial to staff. When the site was previously in use as a gas station, there were edges to the parking area that could and likely did serve as loading space. So if I were to go back to the 2020 aerial image, which is coming up. So you can see that there was a lot more space here along the edges of the site where a delivery vehicle or even a semi could park. Obviously, there would be a gas truck parking to deliver the gasoline to the station when it was still an active station. So that loading space is being removed in a sense by tightening up the parking area to provide the necessary parking for the restaurant. So for these reasons, we find, again, Criterion B supports variances 1, 2, and 3, but we do not feel it supports variance number 4, that there should be loading space for restaurant use. And turning to Criterion C, this is whether the essential character of the neighborhood would be substantially altered or whether adjoining properties would suffer a substantial detriment as a result of the variance. We feel the proposal represents a moderate effort to improve what is already an auto-oriented commercial site. To this end, the essential character would remain largely intact by granting variances 1, 2, and 3. However, with respect to variance number 4, there is a chance the adjoining property at 325 West Spring, which is over here to the east, this could be impacted if there's not an adequate space for delivery vehicles to park on this site. A driver may be frustrated and not have the ability to park anywhere on the site, and they're going to look elsewhere, and they're probably going to take the path of least resistance. So this could become a concern for neighboring businesses, or if they're parking in a location that is not a very acceptable one, if it has spillover effects onto the adjoining streets on South Locust or West Spring, then emergency personnel are going to be concerned about that as well. So Criterion D is whether the variance would adversely affect the delivery of governmental services. So our engineering, fire, and police departments are typically given an opportunity to look at our variance applications and offer comments. They did not return any comments on this, which to me basically shows that there weren't any proposed features here that were glaringly concerning. But again, however, if there's not adequate loading space provided on this site, then there could be potential negative spillover effects onto the corridors adjoining the site on Spring and Locust, which could be of concern to emergency personnel. So we find that D supports variances 1, 2, and 3, but inconclusive on variance number 4. With criterion E, this is whether the property owner purchased the property with knowledge of the zoning restriction. So staff feels that there's little relevance that this criterion lends to the requests at hand. This is pertaining to specific characteristics of commercial site development. Design-related decisions and requests seem to be largely driven by the potential future restaurant tenant. The applicant is following the proper process to have design plans observed for compliance with local code provisions and in turn request potential variation from standards as necessary or desirable. So we find criterion E supports all 4 variances. Go back to the criteria slide. So we're on letter F now. This is whether the property owner's predicament feasibly can be obviated through some method other than a variance. So with respect to variance number 1, the predicament for relocating the refuse collection area from the northeast side of the building to the southwest side seems to be more self-created in terms of desiring an outdoor patio space. So we don't feel that this is necessarily a predicament that has to be solved from a zoning standpoint. So criterion F does not support variance number 1. With respect to variance numbers 2 and 3, while urbanizing the street corner by demolishing the existing building and building a new one closer to the street, possibly in conjunction with other nearby property, it seems to be a more ideal future for the site, but to mandate such measures be done would be extreme at this level. So we find that the building cannot be feasibly reoccupied unless variances are granted to 2 and 3. With respect to variance number 4, so kind of echoing the commentary toward criterion A, if variance number 1 were not granted, then there likely would not be a feasible place to situate a 10-foot by 25-foot loading space on the site. And moving on to criterion G, this is whether the spirit and intent behind the zoning requirement would be observed and substantial justice done by granting the variance. So generally speaking, for commercial development occurring in the GB general business zone, the intent of the code is to try to keep as much of the parking, the off-street parking, to the side or to the rear of buildings as much as possible. Conceal the more functional aspects of the development, like the servicing of trash, away from the public realm, not being located in front yard areas, providing adequate space for loading off-street where delivery or pickup vehicles can appropriately service business activity. So these are some of the purposes behind our code requirements. This is a smaller lot and a tighter context than many others in the general business district, which offer more room to situate features and adequately adhere to setbacks. So given kind of the inherent qualities of the subject site, we as staff believe the spirit and intent will largely be upheld with variances 1, 2, and 3. However, we believe there are some design solutions available to accomplish compliance and negating the need for variance number 4, and thus would directly observe the spirit of the code and respect the loading space requirement. So we find that G supports variances 1, 2, and 3, but does not support variance number 4. Finally, we arrive at criterion H, and this is any other relevant factor. And we find that there's general support that's offered toward all 4 variances. This location at 327 West Spring, it's a prominent commercial location. It's at the corner of one of the busiest intersections in our city, and potential economic benefits should not be ignored, per comments as were shared by Assistant to the City Manager Seth Kropenbaker, which appear in your report. And while prevention of an outdoor patio may not necessarily be considered a predicament with respect to the zoning code, it could help foster a more engaging commercial environment and help draw more customer traffic to the site. Additionally, staff would like to agree with the applicant's statement that the proposed reuse aligns with the goals of the Oxford Comprehensive Plan that's currently on the books, adopted in 2008. And in particular, Objective 5 of this plan voices support for the redevelopment of commercial areas along Locust Street. So we do want to acknowledge the economic development element to this particular series of requests. So at this time, staff believes there is substantial evidence to support variances 1, 2, and 3. We believe more evidence is needed to support variance number 4 to eliminate the loading space requirement. And staff advises the board to be open to any additional evidence that may be contributed during the hearing. So finally, as a reminder, so this is in accordance with section 1139.02C1. The burden of proof is upon the applicant to present reliable and substantial evidence that supports the request for variances. And furthermore, per section 1139.02C2, the BZA must find that practical difficulties exist that would render strict application of the codes unreasonable. So in determining whether these practical difficulties exist, which are sufficient to warrant granting variances, these are the criteria for the board to utilize. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions from the board.
Thank you, Zach. Do we have questions?
The property on Spring Street immediately to the east, is it all the parking in the front of that enterprise?
There is a parking area right in front. I will go to the aerial. So, not too far. So this is 325 West Spring. This is a retail building. Used to be the home of a business called Peak Health and Nutrition. So there are some parking spaces situated in front of that structure. I think if I go to, yeah, this is probably the best slide to go off of. So there's some parking on kind of the east side of that lot, the west side, and right in front of the structure. But no access in between.
And it is a separate owner, correct?
It is a separate owner.
Yes.
Yes.
I have a question about variance 3. The rules specifies that the maximum number of off-street parking spaces provided on-site in front of the principal structure shall not exceed 70% of the total number of required off-street spaces. Oh wait, off-street. I'm sorry, I was thinking there was on-street, so never mind. I got another question then about number 4. Forget that one. Variance 4. Are there any safety issues regarding the loading space requirement? Apparently the fire and police did not think so, but are there any legal safety issues? Like, does there have to be a loading space for a fire truck to be there? Is there any rule about that?
When it comes to like a fire zone, I don't think that this particular code is talking about space for like a fire truck. It's more for delivery or service type vehicles. But I do believe that there are some safety related purposes behind this requirement, especially for a tighter site like this one, where depending on where delivery vehicles park, it can impede the accessibility of the site, or it can impede traffic flow on adjacent corridors. So it's actually worth noting, so in the Uptown district, loading spaces are not required for any land use. And the reason for that is, as you will often see, vehicles will park on High Street, they'll park in alleys, and there's usually plenty of space left over, especially if they park on High Street, for vehicles to work their way around, and it doesn't become an issue. In more suburban locations of the city that don't have alleys or a really wide High Street corridor available at their disposal, it's not viable to park on South Locust Street, it's not viable to park on West Spring. So somewhere there has to be a space allocated, at least on the site, to where there is a viable place for a vehicle to park. I think that's the intent of this section, and I don't believe that intent is being met if we're not showing where that space could fall on the site. Doesn't necessarily have to be delineated that way with striping and such, but just as long as we have an adequate area that is size 10 by 25, which, depending on the type of vehicles, some vehicles, semi-trucks in particular, if there was a semi, would be much longer than that. But again, we're just going by what the code requires, and this is what the code requires. So if we were dealing with a site that were bigger, that was undeveloped, where we had a lot of flexibility to achieve compliance, this probably wouldn't be a huge deal. But it's more of a deal here just because of how tight the site is. But I still think that there's a way to achieve it with a design solution, so that there can at least be a place where such a vehicle may park.
Can you bring up that slide where you had the alternative, the loading space on the east side of the property, I guess, in front of the outdoor dining area?
Yes. This one right here?
Right.
So I don't think that this is particularly ideal. This is probably the most minimal in terms of making changes to the proposal that would accommodate something that is maybe halfway viable. It's not great in terms of the circulation for vehicles needing to move past this location, or especially if the vehicle was much longer. It's probably not the best solution, but this is one way to accommodate a little bit more space for a loading area, while also preserving the pedestrian connection, which is another code requirement, to have a dedicated walkway for folks that are walking to the site on the public sidewalk to get to the building. This is probably not ideal here, having like a sharp angle like this, like a 90-degree angle when it comes to the walkway. And when that code was written and when it became effective, I think this was more of the spirit of what the code is requiring, without it necessarily saying that in the text. But this is probably a better way to achieve a walkway connection between the building and the public sidewalk, to have it be more separated from the vehicular way of travel, because right now it's right up against that curb, that future curb, with the curving aisleway here. So having it be kind of a separate path, maybe something, probably a good example would be like Stewart Square, where you see the walkway that goes diagonally from the intersection of College and Spring. So something that's not right alongside the vehicular way of travel, but is its own route. And the way that these parking spaces are situated, you'll see that they're not like directly parallel to one another. They're kind of offset from one another. So there might be creative ways to redesign that so that you don't lose, say, 2 parking spaces. You might only have to lose.
That walkway?
I'm sorry,
What's the
repeat the question.
dimension of that walkway?
This that's shown right here would actually be a little bit wider than what's required. I just kind of took out one of the parking spaces up here and then 2 down here, and those spaces are 9 feet wide. So I believe what's shown here is about 9 feet wide, but the minimum is 5.
Okay. So So 9 to 5, or 9 is what you've done, but 5 is what's required.
5 is, yeah, what's required. So these parking spaces could be kind of reconfigured in a way that, you know, doesn't lose so many. Like right here, it's taking out 2 here and another one here, so a total of 3. But there might be a way to, you know, kind of move these spaces such that maybe you only take out 1 here and 1 down here, or maybe you do it over here and kind of use this little island as your walkway, and maybe you only lose 1 parking space as a result. So,
Any other characteristics of the walkway other than its width? Does it have to be
in terms of what the code requires, or
curb raised, or just same level as the parking?
so the code does require ADA compliant walkways. So what's shown here are kind of like the dome pads that are on either end of the walk.
Right.
If it was done like that, or this could even be moved up to be in line with like the curbing of the parking area if this were made like a crosswalk. And the code does specify that you have to use a different material for crosswalks as compared to the rest of the parking surface. So if this is all asphalt, then it would all have to be concrete all the way across.
Zach, in direct reference to the Uptown District and the outlying districts, I understand the coding requirement for the parking, but I had a errand I had to run uptown this afternoon. I noted the time at 1:45. There were 4 trucks parked uptown, including the Oxford Fire Department's rescue safety vehicle on the south side of the parks, East Park and West Park. 1 semi taking up 4 or 5 parking spaces. Didn't seem to impede traffic at all. You drive through town almost every time the trucks are parked around. They don't sit there very long. They get their job done, they pick up their stuff, they move on. If this were a complete redevelopment, I understand it would be easy to put everything in. Since it's not, it's making it considerably more difficult to meet all of the standards that we need. Just wondering if, in a case like this actually becomes that substantial, just for section 4, or for variance 4.
That is a potential way to see the arguments. To me, I think it should be favored that if there is a way to comply with the code standard, and there's a design solution out there that exists, then I think that solution should be employed ideally over the alternative, which is eliminating the requirement completely. That's my perspective on it, at least, but what you're saying is another potential way to go about the argument is if based on the characteristics of the intended use, if they can manage when those deliveries are occurring such that when the vehicles park on the site, it's not going to be a problem, whether they're parking over here or anywhere in this parking area. If it's not interfering with customer traffic, if it's not going to have negative spillover effects into the adjoining public rights of way, then maybe it's okay. But I think those are arguments that the applicant would probably need to make that I wouldn't be able to offer.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I guess to that point, signage might be able to resolve some of those issues, but it doesn't necessarily make it compliant with the code, right? So like you said, deliveries during a certain window of time, they could then occupy existing site parking spots?
Yes, potentially, yes. By not having the loading space actually allocated on the site plan, it doesn't preclude the fact that you're going to have vehicles that show up and they're going to be parking in a manner that isn't necessarily coinciding with the way everything's been kind of sliced up and drawn according to plan.
It wouldn't negate the need per the code, but it could be a practical option, I guess.
True.
guess I don't see it as substantial or necessarily want to hinge it on a promise of the operation of the enterprise in terms of the delivery. So the two alternatives that you've kind of laid out, that one and the walkway, I understand the benefits of the walkway, but I also see the, I guess, the less resource consumption for the one on the east side. But either one of those two, I think, are reasonable.
And just to be clear, if I could volunteer this also, the reason for this example here, to me, if we're kind of playing off the existing site details and trying to find a way so as to allocate the necessary loading zone, if we're trying to do that as minimalistically as possible, to kind of scoot this space away from the aisleway width of 24 feet, which in and of itself is a code requirement, to try to fit that on the site and scoot that further down here without impacting the patio, that influence then, or the natural consequence of that is that that walkway would have to be relocated somewhere else. So that's the reason why I'm showing it over here as an alternative.
Sure.
But it is true that if the board were to grant the loading space variance to eliminate that requirement, the walkway as depicted on this site plan would be compliant. It would be code compliant, even though it's adjacent to the vehicular way of travel. Not ideal in my planner's perspective, but it does meet code.
Other questions? Thank you, Zach, for another excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Mr. Webb?
Do I need that or some piece of that? Or?
I was going to say, tell me yours doesn't work either, Scott.
Okay, it's working. Okay.
Okay. You swear to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth in the matters before this board.
I do.
Please state your name and occupation for the record, please.
I'm Scott Webb. I'm an architect in town representing the Day family, the Mighty Mobile Home Park LLC, here tonight for the adaptive reuse of 327 West Spring.
Please proceed, sir.
All right. Well, as always, Zach has done a very thorough job, and you guys have got lots of code information here tonight. I'm going to not repeat a bunch of what Zach has done and kind of talk a little bit more about why we're doing what we're doing and how we've come to the decisions that we have. To start off with, the pictures of the site has been shown. The existing site, as you see, the building is not in terrific shape. The parking lot has been removed. When the tanks were removed, it hasn't really come up tonight, but I can assure you that the site has been cleaned and given a clean bill of health, and that's why we're able to proceed with looking for a new tenant in this particular location. It's no small investment on the part of the owners here. The improvements that we're proposing are completely new parking areas, new curb and landscape throughout the entire site, landscape islands in the parking area instead of a big parking area as it is right now, a new outdoor dining area, and increased green space. Okay, so I'm going to do these a little out of order because it just makes more sense to me. So I'm going to start here with variances 2 and 3 because it helps to explain what's really going on here. So one of the questions that you may have, I certainly had, which is the pointer again? Oh, it's that little tiny red. Okay, got it. Oh, okay. All right.
Taking you back to full screen mode.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right, so a little bit of history here, very, very old history. As we know, the city of Oxford is a planned community. We're all familiar with the original plats of the city that laid out most all of this area, the Mile Square in particular, with South Locust Street kind of being the western border of the mile square. Unfortunately, back at the turn of the last century, surveys and construction was not quite as accurate as it is today. As it turns out, South Locust Street was not put in the right-of-way. It was actually put well to the east, which is why this property line is so far away from the property. So this would be normal. Typically, our property lines are a foot or two behind the setback. And so to start with, this entire part that is colored here that you think is part of this site is not. It's not owned by the property, it's owned by the city of Oxford. That is what has moved our setback requirement then significantly into the site, more so than it may appear when you go by and look at it. Talking to Bear Becker and Dave Smith, the surveyors that have worked in town for a long time, the last widening of South Locust Street, when we added the lane, they actually took an eminent domain easement from the Speedway site because they were already so far out of the right-of-way. They needed to go that direction, so they did. So actually our typical 66-foot right-of-way, which is the original plat, which you see right here, they took another 20 feet of it because they missed it by a lot. So overall, so that kind of explains why, even though we have lots of area there, we don't have as much site as it might appear to be. Subsequently, that coupled with our zoning definition that corner lots are provided with 2 front yard setbacks and 2 side yard setbacks and no rear yards. That's why we are showing the 2 front yard setback areas in this particular location. And as this is an existing building, obviously this isn't, any of these things are things that we can move. You know, we are not intending to tear down the building. This is proposed as an adaptive reuse. And the intention here is to clean the site, to improve this area of the town, and to provide a viable business opportunity here at a reasonable cost to do so. So a couple things while we're on the site plan. So with regard to the parking, Zach is correct. We have lots of parking in the front yard setback because without it, we would be left with, we would be here asking for a variance for no parking or less parking. We feel that parking is important to the success of this business, and so that's where those are. Secondarily, based on the second variance requirement, or rather number 3 as we're calling it this evening, the maximum of 70% in front of the parking, you can see that 16 spaces are required. 30% of 16 is 5 spaces. There's simply nowhere to put 5 spaces, 5 compliant spaces that are not in front of the building. Hopefully, since we made this application, you've had the opportunity to drive by, and you may have recognized that there's actually about a 4 or 5 foot high retaining wall across the back of the property back there, which precludes some of the other questions that have come up. Could this dumpster be tucked back there? No, we can't put a truck on top of that retaining wall. We can't put the dumpster there. Could the loading space be there? Kind of same problem we have. It would be too close to the property line and too close to the building. There's a pretty good sized culvert right here with a guardrail system. As some of you know, this used to be a very wet part of the city. So we're a little bit landlocked. And again, the purpose of the variance here is based on practical difficulty, and we feel that the practical difficulty for the parking variance is fairly evident, that we simply have no other place to put the parking. We are reducing the amount of non-compliance. We're reducing the overall amount of paving. The curb cuts that Zach showed you that are in terrible shape and kind of ambiguous, we're talking about replacing. This existing curb cut is huge. We're talking about cutting that down to a more reasonable size and repairing that and providing the pedestrian access that's required. So that's my pitch on variances number 2 and 3. The parking, we believe we meet the standards for practical difficulty in this case. So the outdoor dining area and the trash area. So obviously the outdoor dining area and the trash area are kind of intrinsically combined here, and it's based on a couple factors. One is that this is the largest outdoor space that we have available that's not currently paved or on someone else's property. So the idea would be to put the outdoor patio there. We feel it's the most logical place based on the site. The intention is we want it to be seen from the street. We want to create that buzz. We want to have some color and some activity going on there to encourage business, let people know that there's something there. But doing so, you know, having the patio here requires us to relocate the trash. There's another reason for that as well, and that is, again, this is an adaptive reuse of the building. So the idea here is that we want to try to reuse as much of the building as possible to try to reduce the cost of starting this project. So the building is currently laid out kind of like this. There's the large sort of back of house area that runs across the back, and all the existing coolers run across the western side. Coolers are valuable to restaurant uses. The intention of our current client is to build a wall in front of all those doors, but go ahead and reuse those coolers and freezers for the restaurant operation. As you could see from the pictures and also from my plan, there's no doors anywhere else around this particular property. So we have made it a little less convenient to take the trash out perhaps, but it's maybe the only convenient way to actually serve the dining area. We couldn't let people out through the coolers or through the kitchen or through the back of the house. So both from a site perspective and from an adaptive reuse perspective on what we want to do with the building itself, this is the logical location for the proposed patio. And that's simply, yes, it is voluntary on our part, it is self-inflicted, so to speak, the variance to relocate the trash, but we feel it's worth asking for because we feel it's a big improvement to the site and really not much detriment to the neighbors. This then shows where the trash would be relocated. It's set up to be able to be serviced as a dumpster straight in from the street. It would be enclosed as required, masonry walls, and our intention is to leave that big tree there and kind of tuck this thing up under it as much as possible. Keep in mind, this is really the front of the building. It is a corner lot. This side has never really been treated in any way other than the side of the building. So, you know, while it is in the front setback and it is going to be visible based on the fact that we don't really have any other place to relocate it, we felt that this was a considered compromise here as a relocation for that. And now we can talk about the loading space requirement. We spent a lot of time on that already this evening. I'd like to refer you back to my original plan here, and that is to say that, again, we only have 2 doors into the property. When this was a convenience store, when it is going to be the new restaurant, all deliveries will end up coming through the front door. They pretty much always did as a convenience store. They're pretty much going to have to as well, unless we, you know, destroy some more of the building or create some other sort of means to do that. So that being said, like we have been talking about the uptown area, people in the restaurant business, people that service restaurants and provide product to restaurants, don't deliver at lunchtime or dinner time. That seems a little obvious, but I think it's important to state here that, as Roger pointed out here, various times during the day, especially if you're up early like I am in the mornings, the uptown alleys are full of delivery vehicles. You're right, sometimes they take some spaces out front. The question from the staff report was, is this a conflict with the restaurant operation? Are we going to have delivery vehicles getting frustrated and parking behind cars while people are in there having lunch? We just simply don't think that's going to happen. That's not the way restaurants work. You don't schedule deliveries during the busy time of the restaurant. Some of Zach's alternates are perhaps possible. You know, the idea of the patio and the pedestrian connection here is to make it visible from the street. We don't really want to wind it around a parking space. Even its simplest solution, if we were to locate the loading space right here, it would be in front of the patio. It would be still perhaps hanging out a little bit from the side, and it would kind of, in our opinion, take away from the visibility and the approachability of the pedestrian access in that location. Further, you know, expense is a factor here in an adaptive reuse. You know, yes, there's always alternative solutions, but there's also cost-effective ones, and that's what we're attempting to do here. It's important to point out we're not asking for a variance on the pedestrian connection to the street. We're providing it. through this location here. We feel that that is more important perhaps than a loading space. Another point that was made was, keep in mind that the dumpster is serviced a few times a week for 2 to 3 minutes at a time. You could certainly park a loading truck. They could share that area, so to speak, and pull off here to the side and wander around the building to deliver things. For us, you know, it increases the cost of redevelopment without really adding any value to the project. It's going to be a little bit of paving that no one's going to be allowed to park in. It's not a parking space. It's not a sidewalk. It's not anything that generates anything. It doesn't really help the business. So it's simply adding cost without adding value. That would be exacerbated by the idea of having to relocate this pedestrian access over here through the center of the site. We're fortunate that the site is relatively level. Our pedestrian access that we're showing already complies with ADA. It keeps the pedestrians above the street and above the parking level at all times. If we were to start here, ramp down into the parking area, ramp back up to here, you know, it's just adding cost, adding expense. As Zach pointed out, we're not simply allowed to create this crosswalk with paint. We got to use another material, just adding another layer of cost to the thing as well. So again, we just feel it's simply something that is not necessary for this business. It's not something that's required uptown. And keep in mind, this is a very, very small restaurant at 2,400 square feet. We're talking about a very small restaurant and a very small site. And we just feel it's simply not warranted. The loading spaces that we see around town that get used, one's behind TJ Maxx, one behind Kroger's, ones that have loading docks. Then people actually go around the back of the building and unload, and they can come up anytime. And we're talking about businesses that have staff to receive things, you know, back of house, kind of full-time back of house staff. That's not going to be the case in a 2,400 square foot restaurant. We couldn't stop cooking to take a delivery in the middle of lunch as it is. So anyway, yes, there are possible solutions, and we'll talk about that when I get to the decision standards. But again, we feel that it's just simply increasing the cost and not increasing the value. So with regard to the decision standards, we believe that, as kind of Zach pointed out, the building really can't be used. We're applying for a restaurant, but the standards of parking in the front yard and the maximum of 70% apply to anything. So if we turn this into a new retail business or anything else, we would be facing the same variances. So as Zach pointed out, we really can't reuse this building without some variances for the parking. And again, I think the variance for the loading space adds expense without value. Well, the variance is substantial, you know, based on my many trips to this board, saying that 70% of our parking is in the front yard setback. I think you have to say that's substantial. I mean, we've heard 4% is substantial before, so I think this is substantial. That being said, the practical difficulty kind of supersedes that, in that, you know, yes, it is a substantial variance, but the practical difficulty says there's no alternatives to locate the parking. So yes, we believe it's substantial. The loading space, we believe, is not substantial, as there's lots of other, our most active business district, our uptown district, simply doesn't require them, and we don't think it's necessary for a business of this size. Whether the essential character of the neighborhood would be improved, we believe it would be substantially improved. All you got to do is drive by and look at the renderings. I think we can make that point, that it would be substantially improved. Upgrading the building, curbs, parking, landscaping, trees, all of these things would certainly improve the neighborhood. We believe that delivery of governmental services would not be affected. I don't believe that the delivery truck would preclude anyone from fighting a fire or getting into this site. It's a corner lot. It has giant curb cuts on 2 streets. You can throw a rock across the entire thing. I don't feel that the loading space or the potential of a delivery vehicle sitting somewhere it's not supposed to is truly going to affect government services, certainly not utilities. I would argue that it's not going to prevent emergency services either. Whether the owner purchased the property with knowledge of the zoning restrictions, zoning codes are movable things and change all the time. It wasn't an issue until we decided to turn this into a restaurant. So I never really know how to answer this standard. I knew about the zoning restrictions. They knew about some of them. We're here tonight applying for variances because now we know about all of them. So that's why we're here. Whether the predicament can feasibly be obviated through some other method, as we said, parking and the trash location. If you are in favor of the outdoor dining area, then I think there really isn't another place for the trash, and obviously the parking kind of answers itself. I think what's important is when they say on there whether the property owner's predicament feasibly can be obviated, and feasibly I take to mean economically viable, valuable, some reason to do that. And so again, the loading space is something that is neither necessary, it's going to eliminate some green space and add some parking and add expense. And then lastly, we believe the spirit of the intent is observed. We're allowing the redevelopment of a vacant site in a very important corner of town, and would certainly appreciate your consideration. And just kind of an overview of the site and what we hope things to look like. As I said, we believe it aligns with the goals of the comprehensive plan and would be good for the community. So be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Scott. Questions, please. Cal?
Is might the outside dining area be moved toward the south?
Sure, but I mean, that takes away one of the reasons that we were doing it. The idea of doing it is so that it can be visible from the street, from the corner, from the intersection. And so, yes, we could push it back, beside the building instead of letting it stick out in front of the building, but then it would not be seen.
Other questions? Okay.
No, thank you, I got a question. Well, yes, I don't know if there's an answer to this question. About outdoor dining areas, is there why do we have outdoor dining areas? Is there a significant return on outdoor dining areas?
Well, for a 2,400 square foot restaurant, it could nearly double the seating capacity in the summertime. As we're all aware, Miami is receding in the summers more and more. This was the most vacant summer I think any of us might have seen on memory here. Summers are really important to our businesses, and to be able to have some extra seating, have an opportunity for outdoor dining that perhaps doesn't exist in the uptown, gives this restaurant something that would hopefully help them be viable.
It's not uncharacteristic for that area either, since
Spring Street Treats is
is right
two doors
up there.
down, exactly.
It's not dining per se, but it's certainly outdoor.
Well, I mean, we hope to have some kind of synergistic effect here for all these businesses by improving the pedestrian connectivity and having some outdoor activity in this area. Maybe they'll have dinner here and walk up to Spring Street Treats.
Go over again why the loading spot somehow detracts from the outdoor dining. In your
Sure. Well, first off, I mean, in order for this space to comply, as Zach showed, I mean, his first slide was to just simply tuck it in right here, and it didn't fit. It's still hanging out in the way, so we're still in the required width for the drive aisles. So in order to even make it fit here, we would have to push this patio back or reduce it in size.
If you push it back, how much?
I would venture to guess, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, almost the length of the parking space, right? I mean, we got to get, this is an 18-foot space, right? So a 25-foot space in order to fit there and stay out, probably 10 or 15 feet, I would think. And then, rather than having this, pedestrian way just kind of wandering around it, they would just end up walking straight down and coming across it. And we would just end up having just more, in my opinion, empty paving that maybe used, couple hours a day at the most.
Any other questions?
One other thing I'd like to say about the loading space, Zach put up the slide about the requirement when extra loading spaces are required. You know, based on that standard, we can go up to 10,000 square feet with a single loading space. This is only a 2,400 square foot building. You know, we think that there's room to say that maybe a building this size certainly doesn't need one. You know, if one is good for a 10,000 square foot building, a 2,400 square foot building could maybe have a quarter of a space or something.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Is there anyone else would have a presentation? Mr. Potter, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in the matters before this board?
Certainly do. I'm
Please
Cole
state your
Potter.
name and occupation.
Cole Potter, I'm a local real estate broker, and in this case, I'm the attempting to facilitate a lease between the property owners and a potential tenant. The potential tenant at this point in time is involved with the owners in the form of a letter of intent. There is no contract, there is no lease. So the letter of intent is based on working in good faith to try and come up with a lease rate and a design that fits the needs of the potential tenant. That envelope is being pushed. The potential tenant is just about there, and we're in hopes that we're able to keep them. There are a couple of issues. One is that the previous tenant had wanted to lower their rent. They felt that their position there in the market was not viable because of the competition, because the Speedway has improved its convenience mart substantially in the last few years, and Kroger has added a service station, a gas station. So consequently, to keep that site at its optimum return for convenience store and gas station was just not viable. And that's why the company moved out, and they spent a substantial amount of money cleaning the site, which they were obligated to do, and so on and so forth. So in looking at some adaptive reuse, we explored with the city what would have probably been our highest and best economic use for the property from the standpoint of a facility that would have a drive-through window. Staff and the city has pretty much told us that wasn't going to happen because of the queue necessary at that intersection. And so we've never even approached the city to try, and because drive-through windows, as you well know, are not allowed anywhere in the city. They are a conditional use permit. So for us to get that permit seemed pretty much totally out of the question. So we haven't even pursued that. So this is what we felt was probably our best use, but we do need to try and hold costs down as much as we can because of the size of the site, the size of the building, the nature of the tenancy. We do have a strong potential in the form of our letter of intent with a client who sat in with the architect with all the design things and so on and so forth. So he concurs with the design. He was instrumental in part of it. So I would hope that you would approve it as we've presented it, because then I think we have a very strong chance of turning that letter of intent into a long-term lease. So, thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Potter? Just a second, Coe. Any questions? Thanks, sir. Anyone else? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in matters before this board?
I do, sir.
Please state your name and occupation for the record, please.
My name's Seth Grumbaker, the assistant to the city manager within the city of Oxford, and kind of within the purview of my duties is economic development. I did want to take an opportunity just to introduce myself to this board and kind of speak very briefly about my role within the city. Really looking for how to support the economics of the city of Oxford, good projects for the city, and not, the intention of my work and work out of our department isn't to find specific developers to work with or specific projects that we like, but to find things that help elevate the overall general economy of the city of Oxford. That being said, the specific project is one that we feel can have an impact, not only with the specific site and its reuse as a restaurant, but to help elevate the entire corridor. We've had some commentary here this evening that talked about impact on other businesses on this area, beautifying the area, and improving kind of pedestrian traffic, creating some destination. And certainly all those things are echoed in the view of the Economic Development Department. One of the questions that got brought forward was about outdoor dining, and that's a consistent through line that we're seeing through formal efforts and outreach to our community, as well as less formal efforts. So things like the comp plan seeing brought forward, desire for outdoor dining, comments through Facebook. So that is kind of within keeping and seeing that this project highlights those things. Also just wanted to speak, briefly to Mr. Moore, and he talked about the lens that he views it, and I'm guilty of the same, in viewing it through an economic lens. So did just want to, recognize, appreciate that I don't share the burden that this board shares, that this body shares, in making the decision. And certainly you've got all those elements there in front of you. So just thank you.
Any questions? Thanks, sir. If that concludes our testimony, I'll accept a motion to move back to regular session for discussion and further action.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. We're back in regular session for discussion first.
I'll start. I like this project, and I was concerned about the loading, about issue 4 in the loading dock, and now I was ready. I think the other variances, I support the other variances just because of the nature of the strange design of this site. And I was concerned about the loading dock, but I don't know what I think about the loading dock right now, so I'd be interested in what others think.
Phil?
I think it's a good use. I think it kind of fits the character of the area, although it's quite mixed up there. There's some other issues about that corner and the traffic, but I think like Kate, I think the first 3 variances are warranted. I don't think I'm willing to go for a variance for the loading dock. I think the possible solutions that have been presented are reasonable.
Sure.
Yeah, I think I echo that. I support the 3 variances. I think it's a very viable project, be good use for the site. I understand the viability of that corner and the aesthetics of that corner. I think that's really important, for the city. I am of the opinion, providing it's not violating a code, that given the size of the building, maybe the loading dock isn't a necessity.
Loading space.
Loading space, rather. Loading dock, yeah, excuse me. Loading zone, I guess we'll say. But yeah, I would entertain, potentially that 4th variance also.
Cal?
I would like to ask regarding the garbage pickup. Where is it going to be?
From the site plan, it was on the west side.
Locust,
The corner of the
off of
building.
Locust, right?
Yeah, on Locust, and it's on the corner of the building.
Here's the slide that shows proposed location in blue.
It's where the existing entrance off of Locust is now, right?
Is there a dedicated time for the pickup, or is that arranged with the business?
That would be arranged with Rumpke.
Okay. Because that is close to the corner, and it's entry and exit out of the same spot there on South Locust. But they can arrange something off
As for myself, I rarely disagree with the city. But my journey uptown at 1:45 this morning, or this afternoon, I was thinking about the fourth variance myself as I was driving up there, because I just picked up my package this morning. I understand the need, desire, and the coding for new development. When we're redeveloping properties, it brings up a special, in my mind and heart, a special situation. And to require this at this point, I think puts the out of uptown businesses at an unfair disadvantage from an economic perspective, to have to set one of those up as compared to the businesses uptown, the restaurants that don't have to and use the city streets. With the observation of the trucks uptown not really blocking, because it wasn't during major lunch or dinner time, I'm going to disagree with the city's position on the fourth variance. I don't think it's a necessary structure at this point. Any other questions, comments?
Well, just let me ask clarification on that. The Uptown District does not require a loading zone, is that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct, okay. That's what you're referring to?
Yes. Yeah, and to ask someone, redevelopment of a small business like this, to go to the expense, and the aesthetic structure would change at that same point. Any other discussion? It's time for a motion, folks.
I'm gonna move approval of the, how do I do this? Of the 4 variances. With regard,
Could you name them, please?
yep. Variance for BZA 202203 being variance to section 114104J3G, trash enclosure location. Section 114907B1, parking spaces in front setback. That's the second one. Third one, section 114907B3, maximum parking in front of the structure. And section 114907E2, requirement for 1 loading space.
So your motion is all inclusive for all 4.
It's for all 4, approving all 4, correct?
Not one at a time.
Do we want to do them one at a time?
I prefer it.
No.
Maybe a moot point depending on how.
Right.
Okay.
That's true.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
Yeah, I'd second.
It's been moved and approved that all 4 variances be approved. An aye vote approves the variance. Can we have a roll call, please?
All right. We'll start with Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Russo,
No.
Mr. Conrad,
Yes.
Ms. Rumanier,
Yes.
and Mr. Ames.
Yes. We have a vote of 4 yeas, 1 nay. All 4 variances are approved. Anything else to come before the board this evening? I'll accept the motion to adjourn.
So moved.
It's been moved to second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.